The story I'm going to share with you tonight is from Scotland, and it is the story of Assipattle, and it is a Cinderfella story. So the Highlands of Scotland are very harsh and very beautiful, and also not very helpful for farming. And so it was that a goodman farmer and his good lady wife and their 7 sons would work from dawn until dusk, tending the animals and the crops. Well, almost all 7, because the youngest, it was actually 6, because the youngest did not go into the fields. He preferred to sit around the house, and they all thought him quite lazy. And the father thought he was a disappointment, and his ma, well, she gave him the chores that no one else wanted to do. He had to sweep and mop the floors, and he had to get the water from the well, and he had to tend the fire. And tending the fire meant that he got the peat, and he also swept the hearth. So as a result, he's covered in soot, and he earned the name Assipattle, which is sweeper of the ashes. So he wasn't actually lazy, his mind was caught up with stories and with songs, and he had tried to work in the fields. He wanted his dad to be proud, but he was so miserable that he had to give it up. And so one day he was sitting on the hillside and he was looking out in the distance at the castle, and he thought, maybe I could share my songs and my stories with the king. I've heard that he's kind of partial to bards, and the more he thought about it, the more that was a good idea. And he went home and he told his family, and his ma kind of scowled, and his brothers laughed, and his dad called him a fool. But that was business as usual. So the next day, he grabbed his harp, he grabbed his pack, and he went to the castle. He knocked on the gate, and when it was answered, he asked to perform for the king. And the gatekeeper led him into the great dining hall where the king was feasting at that very moment and said, "All right, have a seat and play." And so Assipattle, his heart was racing, and this was his chance, and his hands were shaking, but he sat down and he began to play. And as he played, the whole room quieted. And when he was done, the king stood up and came over and said, "Assipattle, I have enjoyed your playing. Come back and play for us again tomorrow." And he bowed and he said, "Thank you, your majesty," and kind of awkwardly bowed out of the room and ran home to practice. Now, the king was a kind man, and he had a daughter, the Princess Lovely, and he loved her more than anything in the world, and he gave her a freedom that unknown to most women in Scotland in those days, and everything she wanted, but there was a limit. And he had told her one day, "My daughter, I love you. I want your happiness more than anything. I will give you whatever you want, but I do ask one thing. You're my only child. You're my heir. I need you to marry someone who brings their fortune and their status so that our kingdom is safe." And she had agreed because she wanted him to be happy, and she didn't really care much about marriage anyway, so she agreed. So Assipattle came the next day and he played. And it just so happened she was studying harp herself, and she had a couple questions. So on his way out, she caught him before he went to the gate and asked him to tell her some things. And so they strolled around the grounds, and they talked about music, and then they talked about books they loved, and then they talked about stories they'd heard and stories they had written, and hours passed like minutes until the princess heard her name, and they reluctantly parted. But they again came back together the next day and continued the discussion, and this went on for days and days, and Assipattle felt more himself than he ever had. He had never had someone to talk to, someone who listened. It was amazing. And so the king asked Assipattle one evening for a song. And so there was actually a song that had kind of been kicking around that he'd never performed for anyone before. So he decided this was the time. So he sat down and he played and he sang. Now, for those of you who know this song, he was having a premonition of several hundred years later.
Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June, and my love is like a melody that's sweetly played in tune. As fair thou bonny lass, so deep in love am I, and I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas run dry. Till all the seas run dry, my dear, till all the seas run dry, and I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas run dry. And the king heard this song, and he loved the song. Thank you.
The king heard the song, and he loved the song, until he looked at the warmth in Assipattle's eyes as he was looking at the princess Gendelovely, and he turned to the princess, and he saw the same warmth being echoed right back to Assipattle. And he knew they were in love. And he was furious. He stood up and he said, Assipattle, you do not have permission to court my daughter, and if you want to keep your head, you will leave immediately and never come back. Now, Assipattle couldn't imagine living without this connection, but he did want to live. So he did. He left the castle and he went back home, where they weren't very helpful. When they learned what had happened, his ma scowled and his brothers laughed, and his dad said, figures that you would fail the only thing you've ever actually tried. And he felt the ground start shaking under his feet, and he thought he was either going to faint or that he was losing his mind. But then he saw things falling off the shelves, and he heard a rumbling, kind of like a pulse. And so the family rushed outside just in time to see the sun completely obscured by the storeworm. Now, all Scotland knew about the storeworm. Indeed, the whole world knew of the storeworm. It was the biggest, the oldest, the meanest dragon that anyone had ever seen. And it was here. So the castle, the king called all his advisors to him to figure out what they could do. This animal, when it was stretched out, it went across the land from ocean to ocean. Its forked tongue could reach out and grab 10 men at a time, and bringing them to be devoured. Its tail, just walking through a village, could demolish the village with its tail. And so he gathered the advisors, and they racked their brains, and they thought, and they decided to send out word to the whole countryside that every able-bodied knight should come and help them defeat the beast. And so they sent word out to the corners of the kingdom, and no one came. And so they thought, and timidly, one of the advisors said, we could ask the sorcerer who used to be in your employ. Now, it's dangerous to be beholden to a sorcerer, but the storeworm is more so. So they called for the sorcerer, who came in and said, indeed, I know a solution to your problem with the storeworm, but it's too terrible to even say. And the king said, just tell us what it is. And so the sorcerer said, well, the creature, the storeworm, is quite old, and it's developed kind of a sweet tooth. So if you send out a maiden every morning at dawn, your kingdom will be saved. And there was an audible gasp, but there was no other solution that could be thought of. So the next morning at dawn, one of the maidens from the kingdom went high on a cliff overlooking the loch where the storeworm was waiting. Determined to help save her kingdom, she took one step off, and the storeworm grabbed her with its tongue and brought her in to be eaten. Now, the Princess Gendelovely saw this from the castle, and she was devastated, and she thought, I am not a knight, but something has to be done. So while everyone was asleep, she crept into the armory, and she found herself a sword, and she found herself a buckler, and she went to that very same mountain. But also, Assipattle had a similar thought, that he wanted to destroy this dragon. He had written enough stories, he'd read enough stories, there had to be a solution somewhere in there. And then it came to him, the idea. He went out and he gathered all the peat that he could, and he put it in a cart pulled by their horse, which was the fastest horse in the kingdom. And they took off. He crept in a boat, and he quietly rowed out, and he observed the storeworm and saw that it would yawn occasionally. and the water would come in and then come out its gills. And as the sun came up, the onlookers came, including the king. But the king was not looking at Assipattle. He was looking at the ledge where his own daughter stood, bravely, nobly, clutching a sword, and the blood running from his face, his heart stopped. But the dragon was not impressed, and it gave a yawn, and at that moment, Assipattle's boat went right into the dragon's mouth. And when the water came out of the gills, he was able to walk around on the inside of the stomach. And so he grabbed the peat, and he went for what he was looking for, which was the dragon's liver. And he found it, and he lit the fire, and he stoked it as only he knew how, and he shoved it as deep as he could. Now, with that pain, the dragon wanted nothing more than to get rid of it. It had tried to expel the fire from its body, but only it succeeded in sending Assipattle to the shore. And the beast rose, and it was flailing, and it hit its head so hard that its teeth started to fall out. And as it flew off into the sky, the teeth were falling out. And some of them became the Orkney Isles, and some fell a little further away, and they became the Shetland Islands. And then he finally died. And as it did, it curled into itself, and it landed, becoming Iceland. And indeed, still to this day, Assipattle's fires burn beneath Iceland, coming out occasionally. Now, at this, the king looked, and he saw his daughter coming down the hillside to the injured Assipattle, and he saw her cradle his head in her lap and stroke his cheek, and her tears falling onto his hair. And he realized that they would have his blessing. There was nothing more he could want for his daughter than this love. And so, thank you, friends, for coming and listening to our stories tonight. Because without you, we would just be sitting on the hillside looking at the castle and wishing that we had someone to share our stories and songs with. So thank you.